the author of several books, and we passed his bio, and I won't take any of his time. So without much ado, Dr. Salem, I'm delighted
Thank
you're
you,
here.
Yvonne. Thank you very, very much, and thank you all for coming. Yvonne asked me to talk about the politics of the Christian communities of Lebanon, and I titled it, because of alliteration, Fights, Friends, and Factions, the politics of Christian communities of Lebanon. This topic is not my area of expertise. It's not stuff that I've done research on, but I do follow from there. I've worked, lived, researched, so I'll share with you my views on the topic. And I have sort of bullet points, 2 or 3 pages of bullet points to go through, and then open it up for a conversation, really. When we're talking about Christian communities, just to situate, we're talking about currently about 1/3 of the population of Lebanon. There isn't an accurate count exactly as to who is in the country, what are the different denominations. The last physical census was taken in 1932. However, there are the voter rolls, which means the citizenship rolls, are accurate and are up to date. So it's not as weird as it sounds. It's just that we don't know of those citizens who is living in America, who's in Lebanon, who's in Australia. That would require a census, but most estimates would put it about 1/3 Christian, 1/3 Sunni Muslim, 1/3 Shiite Muslim, some Druze, some Alawites, and so on. Of the Christian community, the Maronites are the largest, Maronite Catholics. I'll say a few words about their history. Second largest is the Greek Orthodox community. Third largest is what we call the Greek Catholic community, who are originally Greek Orthodox but linked up with the Catholic Church in the 18th century. Fourth largest is Armenian Orthodox, and then smaller communities of Protestants, Syriacs, Armenian Protestants, and so on, Copts, but really very small. So in terms of Lebanese big groups, you're talking about really Maronites, Greek Orthodox, and Greek Catholics, and a sizable Armenian community that came in World War I. When we talk about the Christians of Lebanon, these were the original Christians from the times of Christ. It's where Christianity first emerged, eventually developed into the Byzantine Empire, Christianization of the Greco-Roman Empire of the time. And the Greek Orthodox community of today are essentially the Byzantine citizens from the 4th century onwards, which is the Greek rite of the Catholic Church before the schism between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, which became the Catholic Church, and the Orthodox Church was the Eastern Church. So these are the original inhabitants, ethnically a mix of Arab tribes, Greco-Romans, ex-Phoenicians and whatnot, a very mixed community from ancient times. The split between Greek Orthodox and Maronites began to emerge around the 7th century for arcane church reasons. But the Maronite community developed its own history beginning in the 7th century, partly in conflict with the Greek Church, which was based in Constantinople, but also eventually in conflict somewhat with the Muslim Conquest, which also came at that time. The Maronites, who were largely in what we call Syria today, eventually moved to Mount Lebanon, which was a rugged mountain redoubt where they could hide away from both Byzantine church influence and Muslim imperial influence, and that's really where they've been based for the last 13 centuries. The Greek Orthodox remain sort of city dwellers, if you want, not rebels. They were part of the Byzantine Empire, then they integrated essentially into the various Islamic empires that ruled for several centuries. The government after the Muslim Conquest was Muslim, but the majority of the population remained Christian. This changed over time. You see that difference in sort of sociology and political organization between the Maronites and the Greek Orthodox, in that Maronites are very self-reliant, generally well-armed, good fighters, tough, and mountain dwellers, effectively, although obviously they move now down. Whereas the Greek Orthodox are largely city, coastal areas, integrate with authority and with states that have come and gone. So very different political sociology, which will play out even in the 21st century. The Orthodox community split. We had a community called the Greek Catholics, which are now the third largest. They were Greek Orthodox in the 18th century for a number of reasons, hooked up with the papacy in Rome. So that is the third group. But the Greek Catholics as well share that sociological history of the city dwellers and so on, and not sort of the mountain redoubt that is part of the Maronite history. It's also important to note that the Maronites, for them, Lebanon is the sort of center of their universe. It's that mountain, which is their identity, which enabled them to survive. Their church and its identification with Lebanon is very, very profound. The Orthodox are the largest Christian community in Syria. They were in Lebanon. They were in Jordan as well, in Palestine. They are, of course, Lebanese, but they have also and have had a broader identity. They're not just rooted in Lebanon, and that will play out, we'll see, in the 20th and 21st centuries. So you had the period of the Muslim Conquest, which was really impacted greatly by the Crusades, in that the Maronites generally hooked up with the Western Crusaders during that crusading time, and that began a relationship between the Maronites and the West, which started around the time of the Crusades, 11th century, up till this day, which is they became part of the papacy later on. They had agreements with the kings of France. They had eventually papal educational missions, a center in Rome, and then the French also sent educational and cultural missions. So the Maronite connection to the West is long and very deep. The Orthodox did not have that same experience during the Crusades. That's followed by the period of Ottoman rule, which is the last 500 years until World War I. And here we have the beginning of a very significant new experience, which is the emergence of Mount Lebanon, which was an autonomous emirate within the Ottoman Empire, originally ruled by a Druze dynasty, but then ruled by a Maronite dynasty, the Shahab dynasty. This is very significant in that this Mount Lebanon experience, which goes back 500 years, is the kernel of the Lebanese political identity, even the Lebanese political system. And it's one that the Maronites became greatly associated with, and through the Shahab family and other families, governed much of Mount Lebanon along with Druze families for several hundred years. That's a very seminal experience. I think you had a lecture on the troubles of 1840 and 1860, which was sort of the first major trauma in the Christian modern sort of memory, massacres and so on in Mount Lebanon and in Damascus. Part of the relevance of that began to trigger the thinking as the 19th century wore on, and ideas of nationalism began to emerge obviously from Europe into the Middle East, that the Maronites began to think of Lebanese nationalism, and that they needed a nation for themselves to protect themselves from events like 1840 and 1860, and to sort of realize some kind of national destiny. That led all the way up to World War I, when indeed the opportunity presented itself because the Ottoman Empire eventually collapsed. And during World War I as well, there was an enormous famine in Mount Lebanon when about 1/3 of the population died. And this was a famine because of a double blockade. There was a European blockade against Ottoman ports, and there was an Ottoman blockade against Mount Lebanon because the Ottomans thought that the Christians were sympathetic to the sort of Christian or the Western Allied powers, and Mount Lebanon went through this devastating famine. This gave enormous urgency to the idea that not only with the leadership of the Maronite Patriarch and other Maronite leaders who had very close relations with the French, who ended up being the mandate power over Lebanon and Syria, that not only did they want a national homeland, which is an idea that had come up earlier, but they also then wanted agricultural lands to ensure food security, to put it simply, because they didn't want to relive the famine. And the argument they made to the French, which the French accepted for various reasons, was that they needed not only Mount Lebanon, where there's effectively a lot of Maronites, Christians, and Druzes, and a few others, but they wanted large sections of the coastal plain, which were effectively considered part of the sort of Syrian, although everything was Ottoman at the time, but was more sort of Ottoman, Syrian, Muslim, a lot of the coastlines of the north and the south, as well as the Beqa, as the rest of the Beqa Valley. There's a small enclave of Christians in part of the Beqa Valley, but they demanded the Beqa Valley as well in order to have food security, and on that basis the French drew the boundaries of what is called Greater Lebanon, which is what we know of Lebanon today. So Lebanon, in a sense, is the creation of the Maronites, for better or for worse. They thought of it, they invented it, they used their influence with the French. They dominated it from 1920 up to 1990 as a political system, and we'll talk about that. Let's talk about the early politics of post-1920. The Maronites, as I said, were largely Lebanese nationalists. We're not going to talk about the Muslim politics because this lecture is about Christian communities, but they have Muslim communities, very different politics. The Greek Orthodox communities whose patriarchy is actually in Damascus, so their center of gravity traditionally was Syria, Damascus. The large Orthodox communities are throughout Syria. A lot of the holy places are there as well. So the Greek Orthodox were not as automatic in their sort of falling in love with the idea of a separate Lebanon, separate from Syria. There was also some controversy that as the Maronites and the French were drawing up detailed boundaries, the Maronites wanted to make sure that the largest Christian community in Lebanon should be Maronite, not Orthodox, so they excluded some areas in northern Syria which border Lebanon, which would have brought in many more Orthodox. So there was kind of inter-Christian, let's say, jockeying, which the Maronites wanted to continue to dominate. So the Orthodox felt that they were kind of sidelined in this category, and they didn't have this sort of absolute identification with Lebanon, unlike the Maronites and the Maronite Church. Between the two world wars, the Maronites continued, I would say, to be very Lebanese nationalist with various strands. One was kind of a pro-French strand, very much cooperative with that. One was a more anti-colonial independence, which was eventually represented by the first president of post-independence Lebanon, Shah al-Khoury, who really banked on sort of a more Arab orientation, less dependent on the French. So those were two currents, but still within a very Lebanese nationalist point of view. The Greek Orthodox had varied political leanings, some of them moving towards rising Arab nationalism, which had emerged before World War I, greatly strengthened during World War I, and led to the founding of a number of parties, like the Arab Ba'ath Party, which ended up ruling in Iraq and Syria, the Arab Nationalist Party, and some other Arabist movements. There was also, among some, the founding of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, the SSNP, or the PPS, has different acronyms, which was a Syrian nationalist party, so taking in all of Syria, not just Lebanon. And the Arab nationalist was taking all of the Arab world. So not terribly Lebanon specific, but of course many Orthodox and Greek Catholics also gravitated towards the Lebanese nationalist parties as they emerged. The first sort of nationalist party in that vein is the Kata'ib Party, the Phalangist Party, which exists to this day, founded by Pierre Gemayel. That was founded sort of in response to the Syrian Nationalist Party and some others. And all of these parties were actually, interestingly enough, in response to the very first party, which was formed by a group of Jewish and Armenian activists which had fled, which had come from Russia, and founded the Communist Party in 1924 as a modern political party. And other communities freaked out and they began organizing their own parties so that they could mobilize and do all of that. It's interesting, every time I say Syria, Siri answers me and says, yes, what would you like? I really don't need you on this issue. But I say Syria, it says yes.
Try Alexa.
Yeah, well, Alexa's at home and Siri joins me here. All right, so in World War II, there was, among the Maronite main trends, a struggle between sort of the pro-French and the not so pro-French groups. Effectively, the French, having been exhausted by World War II and not having much influence in the post-war arrangements, the leader of the pro-French movement sort of lost out, and as I mentioned, the first president, without getting into too much detail, was Bashar al-Khoury. And part of the founding of independent Lebanon was based on something called the National Pact, wherein the Maronites agreed to forswear French protection, and the Muslims, in a sense, would forswear Arab unity, and together they would form an independent Lebanon, which would be not part of a unified Arab state, nor part of a French protectorate or any French or Western colonial or imperial plan. And that's how Lebanon was born, in a partnership between that Maronite leader, Bashar al-Khoury, and a Sunni Muslim leader, Riyad al-Sulh. So that's how it got started. The second presidency, which was 52 to 58, so independence was 1943, the first president served until 1952. The second president was Kamil Sham'oun, a young, very charismatic Maronite leader. I assume you know that in the National Pact it was agreed the president would be a Maronite Christian, prime minister Sunni Muslim, speaker Shiite Muslim, and so on. So the presidents were always, and have been always, Maronite Christians. President Sham'oun initially came as a fairly Arabist person. He was very eloquent on the Palestine issue, but ended up in the polarization of the Cold War and the rise of Abdel Nasser in Egypt. He veered increasingly towards the West and towards the US and took his government in that direction, and that caused sort of the first modern civil war in Lebanon in 1958, brief, but really one in which that Maronite leadership was greatly aligned with the West, Eisenhower at the time and so on, and the Muslim community aligned with Abdel Nasser and Arab nationalist causes. That began that period of tension over those issues. Sham'oun was replaced by Fuad Shahab, who was the head of the army, and he brought Lebanon back to a centrist position in agreement with General Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and started kind of a new initiative, I would say, which was a statist one, to build the institutions of the state. Before Shahab, the state was a very, very small, very laissez-faire, did not really take much upon itself. But under Shahab and under sort of French developmental and statist thinking, sort of a bit de Gaulleist, or even that kind of French idea of the state being the center of things, Shahab began that tradition, and in his period of government for 6 years were built the main institutions, many of the main institutions of the Lebanese state, as well as the Lebanese army, Lebanese intelligence, internal security, public planning, Ministry of Planning, civil service boards, all of those things. His idea was to try to change Lebanon from kind of just a coalition of religious sects to a modern state with development and jobs and an economy and move forward. That effort lingered for a while, but did not, in a sense, did not fully survive. In the 1960s, a couple of things happened. A number of prominent Maronite politicians formed a coalition to do two things. One, to push back against this Shihadist, statist kind of rise of power, which was taking away from their political power and their client base and their what you would call Zaim system in Lebanon, Zaim meaning the political boss, and they saw the state encroaching on them and they were pushing back. Secondly was emerging the serious issue of the mobilization of the Palestinian refugees that had come in 1948 and began to be increasingly politicized and mobilized, and particularly after 1967 beginning to be armed, and eventually sort of becoming a state within a state. That's a whole, complicated story in itself. And a number of these politicians also were reacting against that. In any case, the state-building Shihadist thing petered out around 1970, and a new president was elected who was part of that political coalition that I mentioned before, Salem who represented a pushback against that sort of statist jihadist attempt, but also tried to hit and contain or control the growing armed Palestinian presence in Lebanon, and sent the army and air force and so on in very brief skirmishes that immediately were stopped and didn't get anywhere. From like 71 onwards, it became clear that the state was not going to be able to deal with the Palestinian armed presence in Lebanon. And at this time, the Palestinians were doing raids on Israel. Israel was hitting back at the airport, infrastructure, dragging Lebanon into war. But what this led to was that these Maronite leaders began to mobilize training camps and arm themselves for a confrontation with the Palestinians, which eventually erupted in 1975 and plunged the country into 15 years of civil war. Let me mention that, in addition, let me mention some of the parties that emerged in the 50s and 60s before we get to where we are today, the dawn of the Civil War. I had mentioned the Kata'ib Party, the Phalangist Party. There was also the Ahrar Party, which was founded by the Sham'un family. The Franji family of the north founded the Marada Party. There was another party called Hurras al-Aris, the Protectors of the Cedars. There were a number of parties that emerged in the 50s, 60s, and 70s among these Lebanese nationalist Maronite groups. It's important to say that among many other Christians, Maronites included and Greek Orthodox, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, tens of thousands joined the Communist Party, various socialist parties, leftist parties, Arab nationalist parties, the PLO, the PFLP, the PFLP-GC. So, it was a whole spectrum of parties that were very active in this period, but in the interests of time and so on, we're kind of summarizing. The Civil War obviously tested these parties, and the only ones that really survived were those who became militias, or militias/mafias. And those are the ones that emerged at the end of the Civil War, 15 years later, with money, with power, with guns, with influence, and basically inhabited the political space since 2000. And the main ones are the Kata'ib Party, which morphed into what's known as the Lebanese Forces. It has its own history of its own, and the Lebanese Forces, currently led by Samir Jarja, was one of the main militias. It is a big political party today, led by, as I said, Samir Jarja. The Kata'ib Party itself remains, but is sort of the third largest group among sort of the Maronite main parties. The Ahrar Party, founded by Sham'un, all but disappeared. Guardians of the Cedars, all but disappeared. A new force emerged in the very last years of the Civil War, which was galvanized by Michel Aoun, who is currently the president, but was head of the army and was interim prime minister between 1988 and 1990, and developed a very, very large following, which is now a party called the Party for Change and Reform, or the Aounist movement, as some people call it. The third force is led by the Frangini family, called the Marada, which was a militia during the war, remains effectively a militia. So those are the sort of the three main forces at the end of the war and up till the present day. During the Civil War itself, it went through several phases. In the initial part of the war, the Civil War kind of morphed into the Cold War that was taking place, obviously, since the 50s between the US and the Soviet Union, with, roughly speaking, the Christian militias more favored by the US and its allies, and the PLO, Muslim militias, leftist militias, socialists, communists, Druze, and others aligned at the time with the Soviets and with Syria and so on. So that was for a long while kind of the regional and international context of the Civil War. But the Christians, as we're talking about them, went through several gyrations, as it were. In 1976, they welcomed, if not encouraged, the Syrians to intervene in the war, because effectively they were losing the war. And indeed, the Syrians intervened in June of 1976 to stop the PLO and their allies advancing against Christian areas, neighborhoods, strongholds, and so on, and froze the Civil War in June of 1976, largely where the battle lines were for the rest of the war and where the political map is today. That was because of a Syrian intervention. But then from 77 onwards, the Christians began clashing with the Syrians, and that was a war that escalated very quickly. And some of the Christian leaders then pivoted to Israel, asking Israel to intervene to get the Syrians out and to help them. And that led to a first Israeli invasion of 78, and then the much bigger invasion of 82, which routed the Syrians from Beirut and all of western Lebanon back to the Beqaa Valley, or even the northeast of the Beqaa Valley, and brought Bashir Jmail, a prominent militia leader from the Maronites, as president. He was quickly assassinated. His brother became the president from 82 to 88. So there was this period of, asking the Syrians, then asking the Israelis. The honeymoon with the Israelis ended within weeks of the Israeli invasion, and that's another long story if you want to ask about it. The Israelis turned and began their withdrawal, so the new president of the time, Marin Dynasty, turned to the US for help in order to help ensure that the Israelis leave, and also ensure that as they leave, the Syrians don't come back and take over where they were. That effort lasted for about 2 years until the Marine barracks bombing, several US embassy bombings, downing of 2 US planes, and President Reagan deciding, for whatever reason, it's not worth it, doesn't want to do it, turned and left. And Lebanon then fell again under Syrian influence from 84 all the way to 2005. So the Christian leaders tried very many different options. President Aoun, who was interim prime minister in 1988, sort of tried a different approach in 88, 89, which was sort of a nationalist rebellion against both the militias and Syria. Now, why he did it, what were his motives, it's a long discussion, but he created sort of a different dynamic for a while, and that enabled him to build a very wide base after the war ended in 1990. Between 1990 and 2005, the Syrians ran Lebanon, in effect, and in terms of the Christian representation, yes, Syria, I said Syria, I'm sorry. I need to respond. The Syrians ran Lebanon. A number of main leaders were in exile. General Aoun was in exile in France. President Gemayel was in exile in France. And the Syrians ran Lebanon in alliance with Hezbollah and Iran vis-a-vis Israel to keep the pressure high on Israel, and eventually made an agreement with Saudi Arabia for Rafi al-Hariri to be prime minister and sort of run the economy. That they would let Hariri and the Saudis do the economic side, and they would work with Iran and Hezbollah and themselves to do the security side. And that was kind of the arrangement between 92 and 2003. And for most of this period, this was okay with the Americans. There was no real issue or no real challenge to the way Syria was running Lebanon. And the Syrians did not empower any of the main Christian leaders, either because the Christian leaders would be too problematic for them or too difficult to control. They arranged that 2 presidents would be elected, first Yassarawi and then Ini Lahoud, who had no major political power base and did not really represent any major group among the Christians, but would be pliable presidents. This led to a lot of resentment among the Christians of Lebanon, who felt, well, you know, Rafi al-Hariri is a big Sunni leader, Jumblat is a big Druze leader, Nabi Dirri and Hezbollah are big leaders, and they're in the government, but the Christians are represented at the presidency level in this way. In any case, to cut a long story short, in 2003, the U.S. and Syria had a falling out. They didn't have a falling out in 2001, which was 9/11. After 9/11, Syria helped the U.S., intelligence, all of that, and the U.S. was very grateful. Relations were very good. But as the U.S. prepared to invade Iraq, Syria and Iran panicked that the U.S. Army was going to now be in Iraq, and they feared that would be too close for comfort, and maybe their next target would be Syria. So the Syrians began working, as they did throughout the U.S. presence in Iraq, to make sure that the U.S. either didn't invade, or if they invaded, you would have a hell of a time of it. And that created great hostility between the U.S. Bush administration at this time and Syria. The U.S., working with France and others, encouraged a number of leaders in Lebanon, Christian and Sunni and Druze, to join an anti-Syrian coalition, which created a whole new dynamic in Lebanon in 03, 04, 05. That clash between a Western-backed anti-Syrian coalition and Syria and its allies in Lebanon obviously led to the assassination of the leader of that group, Rafi al-Hariri, other assassinations as well, and led to this period where there were what's known as the March 14 coalition and the March 8 coalition, one anti-Syrian, one pro-Syrian from 2005 onward. Of the Christian groups, the Lebanese forces were very much as well as some other smaller groups in the March 14 camp. Michel Aoun and his movement started off, in effect, in the March 14 camp, but then switched sides 180 degrees and joined effectively the March 8 camp. We can get into why that happened. So you have a number of groups, the anti-Syrian, the biggest group being Lebanese forces, but also the Kataib Party, Ahrar, and many others. The other big group being the Aounists joining the March 8 coalition, and the third largest group, the Marada, led by Frangieh, allied with the Assad government, and definitely in the pro-8 camp. So the Christians were mixed in those camps. And that sort of situation endured for a number of years between 2005 until 2011, and go into the details, but a lot of power sharing governments and crises and this and that and the other thing. In 2011, the war in Syria erupted, or protest and rebellion and war. And this was a time when a lot was, in a sense, Lebanon's fate would be decided. If the opposition, backed by Turkey, the Gulf, the US, whatever, won, and then that would mean a big change in Lebanon. And if they would lose, that would also have great repercussions on Lebanon as well. To cut that long story short, the Assad regime and Iran and eventually Russia won in Syria, and that pretty much extinguished hopes that there would be any big sea change in Lebanon. That brings us sort of to the present time, in which Michel Aoun, who was part of this March 8 coalition, becomes president, because both Lebanese forces and Saad al-Hariri, the son of the assassinated Rafil Hariri, realized that they didn't win, so they're going to have to make a concession. Michel Aoun ends up being president in 2016, and that's sort of the era we're in now. The Christian community's politics at this point, again, the two big movements, the Aounist movement led by Michel Aoun. This movement, they have their leader now in the presidency. The president is trying to bridge the gap between Iran, Assad on one side, and Saudi Arabia and the West on the other. He is aware that he needs both sides to govern. He's having a difficult time of convincing people, particularly in the US or Saudi Arabia, that he can do that. His son-in-law, Gibran Bassil, is trying to inherit the movement. Michel Aoun is older and he's not well. Gibran Bassil is trying to inherit that movement. He has a lot of challenges and problems, being the erator of that movement in the coming years. The Lebanese forces, who at the last minute supported the accession of President Aoun to the presidency, Samir Jarjah figures that when Michel Aoun dies, perhaps he can inherit some of the followers of Michel Aoun and build up a stronger movement itself, make a bid for the presidency and whatnot. Samir Jarjah remains in his positioning close to the West, US, Saudi Arabia, and others, very clear in that alignment. And the third force is the Faranji, which is the younger Sulaiman Faranji in the north, who was very sort of wedded at the hip to the Assad family. He's made his bet many, many decades ago, as did his grandfather. Figures that one day he might be president, and that the Assad regime has won, so he has the winning horse, so why not? So those are the main three influential Christian parties, led by Maronites. They have a lot of many other denominations in these movements and in these followers. It's not as segregated as maybe it was in past decades. It's important to say that still, maybe I would say the majority of Christian citizens are non-aligned, in the sense that they're not members of any one of these three movements. They're kind of independent voters. That gives the potential for new movements potentially to emerge, new leaders potentially to emerge, civil society groups. So far, attempts to bring out new leaders or new movements haven't succeeded, but it could still work because there is a lot of open space there. Unlike, for example, in the Shiite community, where Hezbollah and almost mop up all the space there. That is not the case in the Christian community, which is largely middle class, fairly independent, and they're not fully sold with these three leaders, in fact. There's also, for anybody who follows Lebanese life, a huge disillusionment with the entire political class and their corruption and their inability to do anything like pick up the garbage or manage the very, very basics of governance. So although these are the three main political movements, there's a great disconnect between them and the general public, but that yet hasn't played out politically in any major way. I should say a few things, obviously, about the Armenian community, which is about 10%, if not more, of the community of Christians in Lebanon. They came as refugees in World War I, became citizens, integrated into the Lebanese state, have seats in parliament. They're, Lebanese citizens, but they are Armenian still in their culture and their communities and so on, and in their political life. Their main party is the Tashnat party. That is the majority party among the Armenians, and that has been in alliance with the Aounist movement, largely for local reasons having to do with the microgeography of where they live. The second and third part is the Henshak and the Ramgavad, have been generally in alliance with the Hariri movement and others, but they're much smaller. In the near future, I think I've already indicated that there will be kind of a struggle for who's next. As I said, a lot of eyes on after Michel Aoun dies, there will be a scramble for the Aounist movement. There's a scramble within the movement because there are a number of leaders who would want to take control of that movement, and then perhaps people like Samir Jaja would want to appeal to some of that base and bring them over. But as I said also, and I'll say that in closing, the political life is open, that there is room for new leaders, new movements. The new election law, which was implemented last year, is a proportional representation law, which makes it easier for new groups to emerge. Civil society has very wide freedom in Lebanon, unlike pretty much any other country in the Arab world. They tried to field candidates to organize movements, so far without great success, but who knows, maybe they will be successful in the near future, and I do hope so. I will stop there and look forward to conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you. So please, comments, questions, queries, objections. Ladies first. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I quite enjoyed it. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role that the Christian diaspora will play. I know that Jibran Nasira was successful in pushing forward a law that will extended voting rights and citizenship, not only to expatriates who retain their Lebanese identity, but to their children, which increases the number of Christian voters abroad. Do you see that coming into play in future elections, seeing that it didn't shift perhaps things as much for the SPM as they thought they would in these past elections?
No, you're right. That's a very important point. Obviously, Lebanon has the biggest, maybe other than Israel or the Jewish community around the world. Lebanese are maybe the equally distributed in vast numbers around the world. Only a small minority of those millions have actual current Lebanese citizenship, maybe 600,000, 700,000, 800,000. Since we don't have a census, we don't exactly know. But yes, the new law enables now people to vote in the consulates or embassies, and some have. The numbers have not been huge, and that's not surprising. These things are cumbersome and difficult. And I don't, I don't know, and this would be to look at studies that I haven't seen yet, have those votes made a difference in certain localities, because elections are still by this district or that district, where 1,000 votes could swing the vote one way or the other. But I don't know, I haven't seen studies that would say that. It's also important to note that whereas historically there were many more Christians abroad than Muslims, that is no longer the case. That emigration from Lebanon from the 70s onwards has been majority Muslim. And that's just because there's more Muslims in Lebanon than Christians. The Christian migration happened in earlier phases, higher birth rates among Muslims than Christians. And the conditions in Muslim areas of Lebanon have been worse than conditions in Christian areas, socioeconomics and so on. Point being that the diaspora now is completely mixed, and that's a great thing. It's not Christians or one way or the other. The diaspora, whether it's Christian or otherwise, there is a growing link now, an attempt to link it through elections, which is important and significant. There's been a suggestion to create particular seats in parliament just for the diaspora, rather than they vote for a district. That hasn't been approved yet, but that could be approved. But there's been also attempts to change legislation, for women to be able to give citizenship to their children, which would then bring in a whole new bunch of people, like my sister's kids who are not registered as Lebanese, my kids are. That would change the nature and the numbers of the diaspora. And thirdly, to develop investment initiatives and so on, which would enable this very rich diaspora, really, to be part of Lebanon's economic life and economic growth. So yeah, the diaspora is a big part of the country's life and should be a bigger part still. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the Maronites as the largest Christian group. The Armenians make 5% of that group.
Or 10% of Christians in general.
Excuse me, 10%.
Yeah,
Right, 10%.
Or 8 or something like that.
10%. What percentage do the Maronites make of the Christian group, and what percentage do several of the other larger groups make up? And also, how many Jews are there in Lebanon now?
I'll start with the last one. The Jews, I don't know, 12, 15, very, very few. I know some of them. But
Did you say 12?
12 people. I was
okay.
half joking, but
All right, okay.
it's not more than a few hundred, I don't think.
The synagogue is rebuilt.
Okay.
Less than 30 individuals. Is that what we said? Yeah, I know like 3.
Well, that's the sense I had, so I wondered, you mentioned.
Yeah, it wasn't a huge
but, yeah.
community,
Yeah.
but yeah, anyway, it's very, very tiny now. Among the Christians, I don't have the latest figures. I would maybe help me out here. I would think Maronites around 50, 55 maybe, then Greek Orthodox, I don't know, 20,
Okay.
25, Greek Catholic, 15, 17, then Armenians, 10, 8, and then smaller ones, Protestants,
Okay.
Chaldeans, Syriacs, something like that.
Okay, can I follow up?
Yes, please.
And so with this significant variety of Christians, how significant are the differences? I realize that some are Aunas and so on, but is this kind of, I guess, it's not sectarianism, there's another word for it in Lebanon.
Like the Zaim system or the boss system?
The confessional system.
Yeah, confessional system,
This
yeah.
is, it seems to be losing its integrity and its strength. I wonder if you could comment on.
Well, first I would say that the Maronites, and I have said this goes back to their sociology and so on, are very mobilized, very militant, very strong political traditions, I would say, of self-reliance and building autonomous, which used to be tax farming feudal systems in the Ottoman world, but then ended up being part of this nationalist movement and so on. And for whatever interesting sociological reasons, the Greek Orthodox and the Greek Catholics have not, they've had on and off a few sort of big figures, bosses, like Michel El-Mor was a figure, if you want to get sort of into the weeds. And they were very influential in building other political movements like the Arab nationalist movement, the Syrian social nationalist movement, they're part of the leftist movements and so on. But those did not survive the Civil War. And so in the current reality, the big Christian parties, as it were, are Maronite-led and Maronite-mobilized. And then, Greek Orthodox or Greek Catholic will join them, will support Aoun or support Jajar, vote for this or vote for that, or join the party. They have not, for whatever reason, developed their own post-war political parties. That's just the way it is. Now, the confessional system, which is a power-sharing system, is still the law of the land. It's still the law which was adjusted a little bit in the Ta'if agreement, whereas we said the president is Maronite, so I think I'm part of all of that. Every seat in parliament is 50-50 Christian Muslim, and there's so many Maronite seats, so many Orthodox, so many Shia. That system has its many faults. It's also, on the flip side, ensures that everybody's represented and nobody feels left out in terms of communities. So that system persists. Is it weakening or strengthening? I would say governance is weak and sovereignty is weak and political leadership is weak. That is the system exactly to blame, or are there other reasons? That's a complicated question. I wouldn't say that the system is sort of solely to blame for the levels of corruption we have, the levels of tolerance of foreign influence and all of that. I think there's something much sicker in the Lebanese body politic that we have to find a way to deal with. And it's not just, if we change the confessional system, everything will be fine. If we change the confessional system, we'll probably have a civil war. So, that's not great either. Sir?
that leads to something else that you just said, if you change the confessional system. We like to think that democracy is, the way to peace. It doesn't seem to be working that well in the Middle East. Thomas Hobbes' solution was Leviathan. I don't see Leviathan emerging. And I don't know who Leviathan might be.
Well, Leviathan emerged in Syria and Iraq and worked for a number of decades until it didn't, and then you had a much bloodier civil war, certainly in Syria, than Lebanon ever had. Lebanon went for a power-sharing electoral democratic system, which also did not avoid getting into a civil war for 15 years, but also enabled it to get out of that civil war and have 28 years now of peace at a time when civil war has raged just 2 hours down the road, which impacted Christians, impacted all communities. My own conviction is that for the communities of the Levant, which are multi-communal, both ethnically and religiously, to my mind, there's no sustainable alternative to power sharing. And there's no sustainable alternative to some form of elected and accountable government. Dictatorship works for a while, but when it collapses, the fallout is tremendous. Syria is finished. Syria for another 30, 40 years, there is no Syria. And I've talked with a lot of Syrian colleagues, including the chief sort of constitutional lawyer who was Bashar al-Assad's main constitutional lawyer. He left early on. I was in long discussions with him. I said, well, how could the civil war ever end in Syria? He said, the only way it could end if we have something like you guys have, which is an agreement that we share power and that we choose our leaders and we hold them accountable. And I said, well, can that ever happen? He says, I doubt that can ever happen because unlike in Lebanon, the Assad regime prevents the emergence of communal leaders or political leaders who could sit down and make an agreement. And the Assad regime doesn't want to talk to anybody, doesn't want to agree with anybody, wants to impose a Hobbesian solution, which is, I am fiercer than everybody else and I will kill you until you say you submit. That worked in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it partly worked because people still had hopes that this Leviathan state would bring development, it would bring modernity, it would bring Arab unity. None of those illusions persist. It is now simply a bloodbath. Iraq has emerged from its Leviathan. It stumbled, it's still stumbling, but it is emerging and trying its path forward as a power-sharing electoral democracy. Share power with Kurds, Sunnis and Shias, different communities, decentralization, elections. It's not easy, it's not ideal, but the alternative is dictatorship, and dictatorship is brutal, and people won't put up with it anymore. So I say for the Levant, there is no other option. The sooner Syria can get there, which I don't expect it in the next decade, unfortunately, the sooner it will be out of its misery. Yes?
How much the major issues like Israel, the PLO, the refugees, the remarkable, do the parties that are divided on confessional, do they really differ that much on these issues? Are they battling each other? Or on each of these kind of issues, do they see the world in very different ways?
Well, on the issue of Israel, maybe they see things somewhat similarly, but in effect, Hezbollah is part of an Iranian deterrence force parked in northern Israel. It serves an Iranian function. Many Lebanese resent that Iranian function. Now, when the Israeli occupation endured in Lebanon, Hezbollah had much more legitimacy as leading a legitimate pushback and resistance against an Israeli occupation of half of South Lebanon. And for that, it was very popular and gained very great legitimacy. And then, it succeeded, and the Israelis withdrew in 2000. That was a great thing, and Hezbollah was lauded for liberating occupied territory. Great. But from 2000 onward, that's where the deep divisions arose in Lebanon, that after liberation, many Lebanese turned to Hezbollah. Great, congratulations, done a great job, liberated the south. Now integrate into the Lebanese state, become part of the National Defense Forces, let's move on. And of course it became clear to, if it wasn't clear before, that no, they have a different function, which is to protect Iran from Israel and the United States. They also served a Syrian function for a long time, to keep pressure on Israel, because Israel occupies the Syrian Golan Heights. So they were fighting it out through Lebanon. It was complicated. So on the issue of Israel, yes, there's deep divisions, only in the sense that the Lebanese position is the Arab position. Whenever the Arabs agree that Israel can make peace with the Palestinians, we're ready to make peace with Israel. The Arab peace plan was declared in Beirut in 2002. Everybody's happy with that. We'll make peace, we'll make peace with you, no problem. But Hezbollah is part of another operation completely. On the refugees, obviously now the big refugee question is the Syrians, not the Palestinians. The Palestinian numbers pale in comparison. It's not clear exactly how many, but maybe around 250,000 Palestinians in the camps, as opposed to 1.5 million Syrians. So we're talking completely different. The Palestinians are in Palestinian camps under terrible, terrible economic conditions, and that's a whole other story. But also in terms of Lebanese politics, they're not in the Lebanese community. So most Lebanese don't have to worry about that. That is a worry of the army and security forces and so on. But the Syrians are all over Lebanon, and while their presence and integration has been incredibly smooth and unbelievable, it would be the equivalent of all of Mexico moving into the U.S. over 12 months, and yet the country still functions and go around. That comes at an enormous burden, an enormous cost, but so far it has not brought the country down. There's consensus that the Syrians should go home, but it's pretty obvious that they can't. That the Syrian regime doesn't want them home. They'd rather not deal with them. They have enough to deal with at home. Many of them are afraid if they go back, they'll be killed or arrested like many others. So right now, they ain't going anywhere. And that's a big problem for Lebanon, for Jordan, for Turkey. But here we are. It's not currently a very deeply divisive issue. But it could be. Yeah.
I don't pretend to understand this. Everything I know comes from my friend Gossip.
Well, then you're ahead of the game.
I've never been there. My understanding from what you've said and from the sketchy knowledge I have of the history of the Sharq and the Levant is that Lebanon, since, shall we say, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, perhaps before, I don't know, was always a satellite of somebody. Then they became satellited by the French, who then gave the Christians power, whether or not the Christians had a majority, who knew, but it worked well for the Christian French, if you will, after World War I. And that was switched over, and now, over time, they become a satellite of Syria, and to some extent of Iran. And the word Turkey was the first time you mentioned it just now. Where does Turkey play in this, the truly nation state of Turkey? And my added question to that is, do you really consider, and I mean this respectfully, Lebanon to be a nation state, or is it simply an artificial construction of a homeland which is never going to make it to a nation state? Pardon me for asking.
Well, let me start with that. Like all nation states, it's an artificial construction. I mean, and I say that, yes, mumkin. In other words, yes and no would be my answer. And that gets me to your other points, that what is the Lebanese pattern, which is foreign dependency or satellitism, as well as a particular type of internal politics, dates back centuries to the experience of this emirate of Mount Lebanon, and then the Mutasarrifiyya al-Intisage. So what do I mean by that? The Marin Dynasty, which established the Emirate of Mount Lebanon in the 15th century, which was a Druze family, and they controlled this mountain redoubt which had Druzes and Maronites in it, governed by this Fakhreddin, who was a very powerful Druze figure. There's a book that came out recently. So Fakhreddin was fighting with the Ottomans to maintain his autonomy and so that they wouldn't wipe him out. And he lost a couple of battles and he fled to Venice. And he sought protection and lived with the Medicis for a number of years. And there's a new book that emerged recently based on the Medici archives and their conversations with Fakhreddin. And it's fascinating. And what Fakhreddin in 15 or something or other was telling them, look, all we need for you to do is bring your troops, come this way. Those Turks, they're really terrible people. We are Jews, but really we're Christians. You just come help us. And once you arrive, we will declare that we're Christians and we'll help you out. So that goes back to back then. And that continued in the 19th century. You had Egypt as a regional power and the Turks, and the Shihab family trying to maintain their autonomy between these two and then getting caught in the middle, and you had a civil war. The politics of Mount Lebanon was a politics of tax farming, I wouldn't say power sharing, but in effect, a group of families who apportioned out the mountain and governed in that way. They were not connected directly to direct Ottoman rule or the Ottoman state or the Ottoman army. This pattern of politics, of families and deals and all of that, is today's politics. You need a Frangi and a Khazin and a Jumlat. That emerged centuries ago. The system that was put in place in 1861 by external powers, the agreement of Europeans and Turks, was they would choose a president, or Mutasaddiq, the governor, who would be Christian, but not from Lebanon, gets into details, and they agreed that there would be an administrative council, equivalent of a parliament, which would have sectarian quotas. There would be 5 Maronites and 3 Roses. That pattern of 1861 is what we have in 2019. So the pattern of Lebanese politics is power sharing and families and deal making, and a little bit of autonomy and sovereignty with a small s, and a lot of external deal making and over dependence. That's an ancient pattern. In contrast, and there's a wonderful manuscript I would urge you all to read. It was translated into English by Wheeler Thaxton. It has the unfortunate title of Murder, Mayhem, Massacre, and Misery. It's by manuscript by Mikhail Mishata. I don't know if you know of it, but he wrote it around 1865. He was what you would today call a technocrat. He sort of knew about economics and so on. He was an advisor to the Emir of Mount Lebanon, Shihab, and to the Turkish rulers of Acre and Damascus. And you'll go back and read that manuscript of the 1850s and 1860s, and he describes the politics of these 3 places. And the politics of Mount Lebanon, very familiar. The Jumlat came in, and then the Khazins came in, and then he said this, and then they made a deal in there. His journey to Damascus, he says, going from Damascus, from Mount Lebanon, on the road to Damascus, he describes his approach, and he says on both sides of the road are crosses with people crucified and people on pillars, khawazir in Arabic, crucified on a pillar, pilloried. As he was driving into Damascus, in other words, the brutality of Turkish rule in Damascus, which is what you see today in Bashar al-Assad's, it's 1850s. And his visit to the governor of Acre, Turkish governor of Acre at the time, he noticed that many of the people who worked in the court were missing key organs, like a nose or an ear. And he asked, he said, the ruler is pretty harsh, and anybody makes a mistake, he cuts off a piece of it. So what I need to say is, yes, these patterns endure, including Lebanon's problem with sovereignty. And that's a very historic problem.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Ahleen.
Could you raise your voice, please?
Yeah. I want to ask about the relationship of Palestinian Christians and Syrian Christians with Lebanon and the role they play maybe in conflicts. Because Palestinian Christians, a lot of them became nationalists. Syrians not really. So I want to know more about that if it's possible. And whether there is a stronger sense of community based on religion more than, for example, in like the Sunni communities between Syrians and Lebanese. And also,
Sorry, what was the second? There's more sense of community between whom?
the Christian Palestinians and Christian Lebanese.
Like community, like close to each other?
Whether
Okay,
Yeah.
just, yeah.
is it stronger than, for example, the Sunni Syrians and Sunni Lebanese? And also just a little bit about the politics of the Tajnis
Nationalization.
of Armenians and why Armenians specifically and not other immigrants in Lebanon and the effects of that.
Okay, let's start with the Armenians first, because maybe that's easier. The Armenians were part of the French census of 1928 and 1932, and the straightforward principle there was people resident here, if they're resident in Syria, they're Syrians, they're resident in Lebanon, they're Lebanese. The French organized it, they give citizenship, life goes on. So that predated. So when refugees came afterwards, it was a different story. Also, when the Palestinians came to Lebanon, they, even though there was not a nationalization path or a law, they refused the idea of thinking about Lebanese nationality because their whole point was they want to go home. That remains kind of a very nationalist Palestinian position. What they do ask for is absolutely much better conditions. It's horrible, the conditions they live in. But they don't ask for nationality, or at least most of them don't, because that's part of their fight with Israel. They want to go back. The Palestinian, in the initial refugee move of Palestinians to Lebanon, and one has to go back to studies. I'm not, there's much more info about this than I would know. But yeah, and my impression is, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that a number of Palestinian Christians got, nationality right away from President Sharon, but I don't have the facts of that. But yes, that is the case. The numbers, obviously, they were much less than Palestinian Muslims. The number of families that I know, who I knew as Lebanese families growing up in Lebanon in the 1960s, were Palestinian, but had Lebanese citizenship and became integrated basically as Lebanese, and now third generation, you wouldn't exactly basically are Lebanese, they have an ancestry. If you would, you
one
might
more
know.
point, that in my experience with the Christian communities in the Middle East, I find the Christians of Palestine the most progressive politically, the most ecumenical in a secular sense, not in an ecclesiastical sense. They are, many of them introduced social change in Beirut and Ras Beirut and other places, in banking, in research, in entrepreneurship. So they contributed a lot to this mini social revolution in Lebanon. But my visits to Jerusalem and other places, wherever there is a Christian Palestinian, there is progressive thinking.
Yeah, that's definitely very true.
Are you
Also,
Palestinian?
No, I'm Lebanese.
Okay.
I'm a Lebanese Christian, yeah.
Lebanese.
To get into a little bit of the sociology of that, the Christians in Palestine, which were
I'm speaking
immediately
from the
integrated with the British mandate there, and the educational system and so on. The French mandate favored the Maronites. In Lebanon, French education, French government. The Orthodox took a while to find their way, although there were some very prominent Orthodox Lebanese families. On terms of community, the Palestinian Sunni Muslims, if you want to be sort of crude about it, were the backbone of political life for several decades in Lebanon, formed the backbone of the leftist movement, the socialist movement, which included Christians and Muslims, but included a lot of Muslims. So yeah, they were very integrated, I would would say, in a political sense. A lot of Lebanese joined the Palestinian movements themselves and fought with the Palestinians against Israel in the Civil War. But the Shiites split with the Palestinians because of issues relating to the south, and then the devastation of the Civil War, and eventually the departure of the Palestinians has just shifted that sort of geography completely. In terms of the Christians of Syria, the vast majority of which are Orthodox, and city dwellers, or in some in the towns and villages of the northwest in Syria, they've ended up, we are today, very much closely supporting the Assad regime, given how the opposition came to be dominated by Islamists and some super radical, but even the not so super radical, the Christians thought this was just a terrible option, and have certainly sided almost, in vast numbers with the Assad regime. It also helps that Russia, Orthodox power, which is coming back, not as a communist party, but as an Orthodox power to some degree, and they were Orthodox, so there's some affinity there for them as well. I would say the position of the Syrian Christians very different than the wide variety of views among Christians. Of course, there's some Christians in Lebanon who support Assad, but they're definitely in the minority. So there's, I would say, a pretty wide difference there. I hope that answered some of your question. Nationalization law you asked about. Currently, there's nationalization decrees. Nationalization law is basically patriarchal, that if your father's Lebanese, you have Lebanese citizenship, period. There is a battle ongoing to give that right to women. It's come close to winning, and it might still win. It's one of the most important battles in Parliament. It could work. Otherwise, what's been happening since the end of the war is occasional decrees, an agreement with the Prime Minister, the government, and the President to decree that we have these 4,000 names, they shall be Lebanese, everybody signs and they become Lebanese. That's been happening in bouts, and they've tried to be fair, because it's a power sharing system. You're not going to get agreement unless you have Sunnis and Shiites and Christians and Maronites. Everybody's got to be in on it. You can't do anything any other way in Lebanon. So that's where it stands now, I would say. If there was a question. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Regarding more domestic and contemporary issues such as the build-up of trash on the coast, as well as the illegal building of high-rise buildings, that sort of corruption, has there been a trend of the rise of more secular groups that try to get into politics more, or would those issues be brought up by existing parties within the professional system?
Yeah, firstly, it's pretty clear that the governing class is all in on it, and they're all corrupt. Maybe with a few ministers here. There's some good ministers, but they're not political leaders. There's some very good ministers. But I would say the main political leaders are in on dividing the pie and making deals. It's a spoiled system. It's not new, but the levels are pretty fierce and unprecedented. And it's causing a complete dysfunction in actually doing very, very basic things like picking up the trash. So it was one thing for the population to know, they have a corrupt system, but my life is not affected. I'm clean, I have electricity, but trash not being picked up, no electricity, roads are terrible, it rained, everything, So it's become a real problem, and since a number of years, there's been, as you've known, a number of big civil society protest movements, a bit like Arab Spring movements in Iraq or other places, that have emerged in different bouts. There was hope that they could translate into political power. They did well in the municipal elections of 2016, if I forget what year that was. They did very well. They almost won the elections for the municipality of Beirut, which is almost unheard of. But they've done well in municipalities here and there, and you'll find there's about 2,000 municipalities in Lebanon. Some of them are excellent. And to the degree that they can control things within their municipality, they're doing beautiful work. But attempts to break into the central government, as I said, municipal elections, they did well. There were hopes with the new election law that this movement would bring new faces. Only arguably one person made it into parliament, Paula Yacobian, and we get into details. So, for whatever socio-political reasons, and I could ask you, you know, why did the U.S. elect Donald Trump? I don't know why people elect him, but these guys are still winning elections. You know, the warlords with all the corruption and everything. But at least the political system is open. You can run an election. You could win an election, but you got to win an election.
Sorry. You mentioned that something about during the Civil War and shortly after the Shia split with the Palestinians. Where were it seems to me like Amal, like you mentioned, Amal and Hezbollah really are the Shia political world. Those two parties only came around like in the 70s, 80s. Where were the Shia before that?
Excellent question. A couple of things. The Shia were a number of things. One, unmobilized would be one way to put it, because they were largely in the rural areas in the south and in the north. They had very resilient, I would say, feudal lords like the, I forget the names now because I've been away for a while, but the Sabri Ahmedis and, you know, big feudal families. Husseini, sort of a newer figure. Anyway, they had a feudal past which persisted because they were very rural, very poor areas. The first mobilization actually was with the Communist Party. They made great inroads because their message was very, very powerful. Also, in a way, Shiyu'i and Shi'i sounds very close, so that helped. It's the same word, Shiyu'i and Shia. Anyway. But anyway, and then a number of the other regular parties tried to mobilize them. But the big mobilization happened with Musa Sadr, effectively in the late 60s and 70s. There's a lot written about Musa Sadr, a very charismatic figure, who really was the one to mobilize the modern Shiite, if you want, you know, moving out of the villages to the cities, becoming more educated, overthrowing the old feudal families, and beginning to integrate differently. That movement turned into the Amal movement. It's a long story. That is the Amal movement, which is currently was a militia during the war and corrupted. Yes, is now currently very corrupted. That's Nabih Berri and Amal movement. It's a big base, long history. Hezbollah itself is the creation of post-revolutionary Iran. Effectively, after the 82 invasion, really gained ground. You know, that story is well known, and the funding and the mobilization, great service network, and the rest of it. And they liberated the South, for which they are heroes. But even in the 1990s, when you look at election results, a full 1/3 of the Shiite population of the South voted against Hezbollah for a coalition of leftist progressive parties. This you can see in the election results of 92 and 96. That is lost now. There isn't this big third way among the Shia anymore. Why? What are the reasons? Hezbollah, money, whatever. But currently, the third way among the Shia is midget, is minuscule. It doesn't really exist. So yeah, they are very basically dominated by Hezbollah, and Amal is allowed to operate because Hezbollah allows it to do so. It cannot function without Amal, without Hezbollah say so. So that's just currently unfortunately, where it is. A lot of the Shiite intelligentsia in Beirut and elsewhere is opposed to both of them, but they really have nowhere to go. And if anybody really gets out of line, they will be told you can't go there. So that's kind of the situation.
One last question.
How do all the different groups maintain their identity? So they all live somehow together, struggle, have all those deals. Why does they not slowly emerge some sort of more national?
Yeah, this maybe goes back to that earlier question. And I'll take you, look at America. I mean, America has a strong identity and huge racial problems, for example. It's not a contradiction. Lebanese are 100% Lebanese. Everybody is Lebanese to the core at this point. In 1925 they weren't, but now Hezbollah followers are die-hard Lebanese, Marin, everybody's very Lebanese. Part of that is the shared experience, the love of Lebanon, love of the country, love of the land, love of the culture, love of the music. I mean, Lebanon is a unique, amazing, incredible place. And they have sub-identities. Political, sectarian, ethnic, like you have very visibly in America as well. Now, the political system both integrates and manages that fine, you can have multiple, you can be in the state, but it also perpetuates it, because it keeps reminding you, hey, you can't be president if you're not married, right? So it's both the solution and the problem at the same time. And that's different than the issue of sovereignty and why is there an Iranian army in Lebanon. That gets you to a different discussion. And why, Lebanon lost its sovereignty back in 1969 when the Palestinians, the Lebanese were forced to sign an agreement. Egypt, Abdel Nasser forced the Lebanese to sign an agreement allowing the PLO to launch raids to Israel and to allow the PLO a base, which is why the Shiites ended up being upset at them. We've lost our sovereignty since '69. We haven't regained it yet, so it's been 50 years. That's a different discussion. So Lebanese are deeply Lebanese, have enormous things in common, and they have their differences, including different identities, sub-identities, but a lot of shared identity, very, very strong nationalism, but that doesn't necessarily translate into good governance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.